Hello class, welcome back. VO2 max time in terms of whiteboard sessions. If anyone has ever done a VO2 max, it hurts. You gotta run on the treadmill till you literally fall off it. Maybe not fall off, but you're basically about to. Or you're on the bike and you keep going until you just crumple down and just cannot go anymore. It is one of the best and worst experiences, if that makes sense, when you're undergoing training. So this whiteboard is going to review how do you get there from exercising at minimal intensity to maximal intensity. What are the fuel sources you use at the different percentage increases in terms of your VO2 max. So hope you enjoy it. Next time you're really gunning hard, running up that hill or plowing away on your bike, just kind of remember your different fuel sources and enjoy the burn, so to speak.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about energy expenditure, and we're going to go through three categories. We're going to begin at the cellular level with cellular respiration, and that many people are probably familiar with. Starts with glycolysis. We have the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. And see how that translates into physiology in this equation called the respiratory exchange ratio, and then see how that translates into what's called VO2 max. So in a nutshell, we're going to go from cell biology to human physiology and see how that translates into performance, VO2 max. So in broad strokes here, we're going to begin with some basic terms here. At rest, our bodies all consume approximately 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. Now that might be a complex equation, but fortunately there's a very easy equivalent term that has been generated called 1 metabolic equivalent, or 1 MET. And as our body exercises, it'll progressively increase its use of oxygen, which will slowly increase the MET level. So for example, we can go to 2 METs, 4 METs, 6 METs, etc., which is a much easier term to grasp. Now again, at rest, our basal metabolic rate for example, 70 kilogram individual translates into using about 0.3 liters of oxygen per minute. And as we progressively exercise, the oxygen consumption goes up, and we can see exactly how much oxygen we're consuming and carbon dioxide we're producing by this equation called the respiratory exchange ratio, when you see people using gas masks on a treadmill when doing a VO2 max test or an exercise stress test. But in order to understand that, we have to review some basic cell biology and cellular respiration. So we're going to start with glycolysis. And again, very simply, we have a glucose molecule, which gets broken down into pyruvate. And that generates about 2 molecules of ATP, or energy. Then that pyruvate gets shuttled, I'm going to try to draw this big enough here, into the mitochondria. We have our double membrane, our cristae of mitochondria here. Now that pyruvate then gets converted into what's called acetyl-CoA, and that can enter the Krebs cycle, or citric acid cycle, where there are successive steps that generate not only further ATP, another 2 direct ATP, but a whole bunch of NADH and FADH2. Those enter the electron transport chain within the mitochondria membrane, electron transport chain, and that generates another 34 ATP. So in theory, 1 molecule of glucose will generate 38 ATP. Now, some texts say it's actually 36 ATP, depending on how much NADH versus FADH our body is using. And in some modern texts, we're actually realizing in reality it's probably more like 30 to 32, because there's a lot of losses. There's energy required when we're transporting pyruvate, as well as when we're trying to regenerate the substrates for energy, which is ADP and phosphate. It requires energy to transport them back and forth. But still, a lot of texts will stick with the old 38 ATP. Now, fat, on the other hand, has multiple carbons, whereas glucose had 6 carbons. Fat has several carbons in a chain. So if we have, in a very simple drawing here, each one of these links here are carbon molecules. We have several carbons. For example, 18 carbon fat molecule is stearic acid, 16 carbon being palmitic acid. Each one of these carbon molecules gets cleaved off of the parent molecule one by one, and they then form a molecule called acetyl-CoA, which we're familiar with from before. That can enter right in to the Krebs cycle once again. That generates about 8 ATP. For example, if we use a 16 carbon molecule of fat, which will represent as C16H32O2, and then 121 additional molecules of ATP via oxidative phosphorylation and the electron transport chain. So our 16 carbon fat molecule generates in total 129 ATP, where our 6 carbon glucose molecule, which we can draw here as C6H12O6, generates only 38 ATP. So at first glance, it seems like fat is the clear winner in terms of energy. But this is where things get interesting with the respiratory exchange ratio. So we have some chemistry equations here. If we have our glucose molecule, C6H12O6, we need 6 molecules of O2 to oxidize that. And as a result, we're going to generate 6 molecules of CO2, 6 molecules of H2O, and we are going to yield us our 38 ATP. Another way to look at that is our carbon dioxide production, V representing ventilation, divided by our oxygen consumption, and we get 6 CO2 divided by 6 O2 for an easy respiratory exchange ratio of 1.0. So if you look at things closely, we generate 38 ATP per 6 molecules of O2, which equals 6.33 ATP per molecule of O2. Now, ATP can also be converted to kilocalories of energy, which we don't have the time to go into, as it can be very complex, but it roughly translates to 5.05 kilocalories of total energy per molecule of O2. Now let's take a look at fat. So if we have our 16 carbon molecule H32O2 fatty acid molecule, that requires 23 molecules of oxygen to oxidize, and we generate 16 molecules of carbon dioxide, 16 molecules of H2O, and that yields us our wonderful 129 molecules of ATP. Or when we look at that in the form of a respiratory exchange ratio, we have the VCO2 divided by VO2, that is going to be 16 divided by 23, which gives us our 0.7 RER value for fat. When you look at that another way, we have our 129 molecules of ATP that require 23 molecules of O2. We only yield 5.6 molecules of ATP per molecule of oxygen. And in kilocalories, 4.69 kilocalories of energy per molecule of O2. So, put head to head here, we have 6.33 molecules of ATP per O2 versus our 5.6 ATP per O2. And the other version is 5.05 kilocalories of energy versus only 4.69 kilocalories of energy per molecule of O2 used. So suddenly, glucose becomes the clear winner, as it is much more efficient. Unfortunately, there's a limited supply of glucose. The average person may have about 400 grams of glucose in its storage form called glycogen. About 100 grams is stored in the liver, the rest being in the muscles, and only about 3 to 4 grams circulating in your plasma. So we have only about 503, therefore, total grams of glucose available in our body, which yields about 2,012 calories of total energy. Contrast that to fat. The average individual has about 12,000 grams of fat storage, and that's with a 15% body fat average individual. We have about 300 grams of intramuscular triglyceride, about 0.4 grams of circulating free fatty acids in the plasma, and then about 4 grams of plasma circulating triglycerides. That gives us 108,000 kilocalories of energy. So, unfortunately, while glucose is very good at yielding us energy, we have an endless supply of fat for energy. So our body ends up doing a balancing act as we exercise. At rest, our body decides to conserve glycogen and use its endless supply of fat. So when we're at rest, our respiratory exchange ratio is in theory going to be 0.7 if we're oxidizing purely fat for energy. In reality, we do end up consuming a very low amount of carbohydrate at rest, so it in general is more likely 0.5 to 0.8. And that translates to roughly about 16 to 17, up to about 33% utilization of carbohydrate, and the rest, the majority, being fat. Now, if we begin to exercise, for example, at about 25% of our theoretical maximal exercise state, which you can represent as our VO2 max, we are primarily using fat in the form of free fatty acids, intramuscular triglycerides, and a little bit of the circulating plasma glucose. As we start to take it up a notch and we go to about 65% of our maximal oxygen consumption, VO2 max exercise state, we get a progressive increase in glycogen use, and in very, very rough terms, a 40-30-20-10 split here, where we're using mostly glycogen, still using a decent amount of fat in the form of free fatty acids and intramuscular triglycerides, and a much less percentage of our plasma glucose. And then when we get to very, very high intensity exercise states, such as 85% of our VO2 max, we're at, again, in rough terms, maybe roughly 60 to a 15-10-5 split here of glycogen, plasma glucose, free fatty acids, and intramuscular triglycerides. So you can see that as our energy needs increase at much higher exercise intensities compared to a lower, we are using a heck of a lot more glycogen. And you could see at rest or very low in intensity states, at 25%, there is no glycogen use at all. And just to give us a very rough real-world translation of what this entails, for example, if you're exercising at about 25% of your max, that would be like a brisk walk on flat terrain or a slow ride on your bike. 50%, now you're breaking into a jog, or you're walking, but you're walking uphill or hiking. About 75%, where you're starting to really push it, now you're jogging, but it's an uphill jog. Or you're playing soccer, for example, where you're doing a lot of running, or you're riding a hard ride or going up that climb uphill. We can use respiratory exchange ratio to monitor exactly how much we are exercising in terms of VO2 max and exercise intensity. Fat is going to be 0.7. And as we progressively go up, obviously 0.8, 0.9 to 1.0, this is pure glucose. If you recall, we have our 16 CO2 produced, 23 molecules of oxygen needed, versus our simple 6 CO2 to 6 O2 equation. And this is exactly what we are using when we put someone on a treadmill and do a VO2 max test or exercise stress test, cardiac stress test. we put a mask on and we measure how much carbon dioxide they're producing versus how much oxygen they're consuming, and then we know their exercise intensity. Now we can use VO2max to therefore calculate a percentage of your maximal exercise state and be able to prescribe training zones in terms of your exercise max, which a lot of people use as their heart rate, but in more advanced exercise labs and elite athletes will often use lactate threshold, which we'll discuss in our next session.